Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcella Paris, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I would like to welcome you all to the Great Falls Forum. The Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, and academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of the Lewiston Public Library, Bates College, and the Sun Journal. This is our 24th season of the program, so we thank you for your ongoing support. And a recording of today's program will be available immediately after this program on Facebook and tomorrow on the library's YouTube page. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. And also please mark your calendar for the next Great Falls Forum, which will be on Thursday, March 17th, also at 12 noon, featuring author and registered Maine guide, Earl Brecklin, with a talk entitled, "So You Think You Know Maine? Think Again." More information on that is now available at lplonline.org. And a little housekeeping for today's program. So those of you on Zoom will see a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. Use this to enter any questions for the speaker today. She will end the program with questions. And for anyone joining us on Facebook Live, you're welcome to type your questions into the comment box there, and we will make sure that it gets to our speaker. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Stephanie Kelley-Romano. Stephanie Kelley-Romano is an associate professor in the Rhetoric, Film, and Screen Studies Department at Bates College, where she has taught since 1999. She earned her undergraduate and MA degrees at Emerson College in Boston, and her PhD in Communication Studies earned at the University of Kansas. Her research and teaching interests include gender and media, myth and narrative, conspiracy, political rhetoric, and substance misuse, disorder, and addiction. Her scholarship has appeared in such journals as the Journal of Hate Studies, Communication Quarterly, Journalism Studies, and the Journal of UFO Studies. She's often sought after for podcasts on political or paranormal topics, and her public scholarship has appeared in Newsweek.com and The Conversation. Stephanie receives the Krebs Teaching Award at Bates College for excellence in teaching in 2019. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Stephanie Kelley-Romano to the Great Falls Forum. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. You absolutely covered it all. I am going to try to share my screen now and get right to it. As you already know, my name is Stephanie Kelley-Romano, and I am at Bates in the Department of Rhetoric, Film, and Screen Studies. A little bit more information about me. I started publishing about conspiracies back in 2008 when I was writing about the X-Files. And since then, in terms of conspiracies, I have written about Donald Trump, the birther movement. I've studied the spread of conspiracies with epidemiology models and mathematics professor Meredith Greer. I've studied school shootings and conspiracy theories with Professor Michael Roque, and I've also looked at Fox News, the Kavanaugh hearings, the Pentagon, and UFOs, and I've given several talks on COVID conspiracies. So obviously, a lot of my current scholarship and teaching does look at conspiracy. Today, I've prepared about 40 minutes of information about conspiracy theories, but I have a tendency to talk a little fast, so it might only be 35. There's no way I can cover everything. I teach entire courses on conspiracy rhetoric. And so my goal today is to simply raise some issues that I think are important when we start thinking and talking about conspiracy theories. I'll also, at the end, take questions. And I have a lot of resources for further reading that will be distributed and available for you all. So as I define what a conspiracy theory is, I want to start to think about the three questions intimated by my title. Why do we believe in conspiracy theories? How should we think about conspiracy theories and other types of information? And what can I do to protect myself from and maybe talk to my aunt or cousin about conspiracy theories? Before I begin virtually any talk, I start with this whole what is rhetoric question, because this is important in the sense that what it does is it articulates the disciplinary boundaries within which I work regarding conspiracy rhetoric. And it can also give us some clarity and precision regarding language as we approach this topic, which is very important. So when I talk about rhetoric, I'm talking about communication and persuasion, but I'm also talking about the creation of truth, what we believe. obviously, when we're talking about conspiracies, fake news, misinformation, and just general truthiness, understanding the process by which we come to believe those things is really important. And so we create that through forms, what we call in rhetoric forms, right? Think speeches, memes, television shows, and also symbols. Think language, visual symbols, even nonverbals, right? So while considering both forms and symbols, I also consider the role of authority and expertise and the broader cultural context that potentially inhibits or encourages the acceptance of particular sources or explanations in the creation of truth. Or more accurately, I studied the struggle over truth. Why does some stuff stick? Today, I'm going to use anti-vaccination movement as an example on and off, because there we have a public discursive space that is still contested despite the overwhelming medical knowledge and agreement about the safety of vaccines. So what, and here I'm really talking about the connection between autism and vaccines is the example that I'm using. So what is going on there? And again, this is apart from arguments about personal liberty or freedom. This is about how does misinformation continue to get redeployed and stick in the public sphere. So in order to understand what exactly is going on, we need to know about some different types of information. And the most basic type of problematic information is just misinformation. Misinformation happens when we mishear things, when we misunderstand them, or otherwise garble the truth on the way to understanding. So, for example, I may have seen a study on the internet that links vaccines with autism, and I believe it because it's on my cousin's Facebook page and I like her. So I have misinformation, right? I have information that's not true. The second type of information that's relevant for us here is disinformation. And with disinformation, misinformation is deliberately conveyed as true for some usually political or financial gain. So it's misinformation strategically deployed. Joe Kennedy or Jenny McCarthy might retweet negative experiences with vaccines, alluding to autism, to their followers in order to convince people to vote against mandatory vaccines in public schools. Now, even here in this example, we're still not necessarily at the level of what I would call a conspiracy. It might be deliberately manipulative, but it's not a conspiracy. And let me tell you why. For a conspiracy theory, there needs to be a motive and there needs to be some quote unquote evil, right? Now, Richard Hofstadter writes extensively about the paranoid style in American politics, and he's been quoted a lot over the past few years. And likewise, Earl Krebs wrote about conspiracy rhetoric as a rhetorical genre. And it's Krebs who adopts this word evil. And I put evil in scare quotes, but there absolutely needs to be some sort of nefarious reason for the happenings of history in order to call a narrative explanation a conspiracy, or in order for me to call a narrative explanation a conspiracy. Conspiracies become a motive force in history. So in our autism example, when the narrative changes to one where Andrew Wakefield, who was the former doctor whose research connected autism with vaccines and whose research was shown to be fraudulent, when the narrative surrounding him changes to one where he is said to be deliberately discredited to silence the anti-vaccination movement so that the government will be able to control people through vaccines, then we get to the level of a conspiracy theory. So a conspiracy theory is a belief that there is a secret plan by a group to do something unlawful or harmful for some larger evil motive. There has to be that evil at the center of the narrative for me to call it a conspiracy. And in my work, I unpack conspiracy theories to understand what is that evil, what is the fear, what are the conditions that hold conspiracy theories together, which brings us to our first question for today, finally, which is why do people believe them, right? Now, understanding how and why particular narratives work in particular historical times is the work of the rhetorician. And this is why I totally love what I do, right? I am a little rhetorical detective. And so when we do rhetoric, we consider what is known as the rhetorical situation. And I'm going to use the elements of the rhetorical situation, which are the constraints, the audience, to help us, and the exigence, to help us understand conspiracy theories and how we should organize our thinking about them. So when we consider the exigence encourages us to think about what conditions call the rhetoric into being. And I can start with a bit of a spoiler in terms of the actual social scientific research. Joe Uzinski and Joseph Parent in 2014 found that the level of conspiracy belief remains pretty constant over time, right? And even as recently as 2019, the data indicates that even though it may seem like we hear more about it, and we might hear more about conspiracy, the number of people who actually believe conspiracy theories remains about the same. So even when we feel like this moment is heavy with conspiracy, we can say with some confidence that conspiracy theories don't ebb and flow nearly as dramatically as we may think. And not as many people believe actual conspiracy theories as we sometimes assume, right? Particularly when we parse out misinformation or disinformation, the number of true conspiracy theorists get pretty small. And that's important because depending on where a person falls in that creation of belief kind of process, determines which rhetorical strategies are going to work in helping people to change their minds or opening up public discourse. So we also know that there are certain conditions or exigents which make people more likely to believe in conspiracy. So we know, and if you've read anything about this, you've probably heard all this, right? We know that in times of uncertainty, conspiracy beliefs rise because people want explanations. And for us as humans, the size of the event requires an appropriately sized explanation. So, for example, when Princess Diana died in a horrible car crash, which seems random, this explanation was insufficient for many people. And so there were conspiracies about this happening, the royal family orchestrating it, that rang true for some people. A bigger explanation, a bigger motive needed to be present. Additionally, conspiracy theories capitalize on a lack of trust in official explanations or institutions or media sources. We know that in times of especially economic destabilization, we have increased belief in conspiracy theories. And likewise, when things have perceived risk, conspiracy theories tend to be more believed and more present or offered up as potential explanations. So for us today, in this global pandemic with unknowable risk, with economic instability, with lack of simple, easy answers, we are in this perfect storm of cultural, historical, psychological exigencies that are conducive to conspiracy theorizing. So the exigence we can begin to understand, right? We're in a scary time. And so what do people do? I don't know about y'all, but I Google it, right? Whether it's my personal medical symptoms or larger cultural climate, I Google everything because information is soothing to me. Information, knowledge provides comfort. And unfortunately, here's where things can get complicated because there are a variety of constraints that affect and influence the type and quality of information that we receive. So constraints like massage the information we receive. They tint it based on individual or societal biases and attitudes. And so one of the constraints regarding conspiracy theories, and again, there are many, I cannot talk about them all, but one of them can be seen in the history of regulations in broadcasting, right? So in the early 1940s, amid fear of propaganda, the FCC had what was called the Mayflower Rule, which prohibited editorializing. And this proved difficult to enforce, and it was oftentimes enforced with the stations, not necessarily the networks or the content creators. The stations were the ones held to enforcement. So then the Fairness Doctrine was adopted in order to ensure that all holders of broadcast licenses, radio and television at the time, would present controversial issues in a way that was, quote, honest, equitable, and balanced, unquote. Now, this was a rule designed to ensure that people were exposed to a variety of viewpoints, and it required that those being talked about be allowed to respond. So we adopt this fairness doctrine to present information to the public in a way that is fair and as objective as possible. And it positions the public interest kind of at the center of media motive, at least ostensibly. Now, obviously, these things are incredibly limited. I'm talking about them in gross generalities. And they were absolutely entrenched in systems of power. But while not perfect and not even as democratic in practice as they may sound to us today, they did encourage a different ethos within mainstream media as technology and access to information grew. So in 1987, which increasingly is not that long ago, right? This policy was eliminated. And in practical terms, what that meant was that news reporting could now basically be positioned for maximum readership or viewership. Broadcasts no longer had to be equitable, honest, or fair. And again, it's an oversimplification, and I'm definitely not arguing that a reanimation of the fairness doctrine would be a panacea for what ails us in our current infodemic. But context does matter. And if we think back to what we were talking about when we talked about rhetoric, these rules and regulations influenced the forms of rhetoric as we got radio, television, and other forms of media. So meanwhile, also simultaneous to that, we have the expansion of the internet, right? As a medium of communication and opportunity, it's huge. The degree to which it has revolutionized the way we know, the way we work, and even the way we think, in my estimation, cannot be understated. It's huge. So as the constraints on information around fairness are removed, access to information exploded, and our individual ability to assess and weigh information, as well as even our ability or knowledge on how to do that, definitely did not keep up. So the thing is, we all have misperception. We all believe some disinformation. And most conspiracy researchers note that most of us believe in at least one conspiracy theory. So we come back to that same question, why? And of course, my answer is rhetoric, right? When I grew up just north of Boston. I grew up watching Chet Curtis and Natalie Jacobson on the nightly news. So I had expectations about objectivity and about evidence and about journalistic integrity. The same when reading the local paper. And what happened was I was conditioned to read the cues of the form. Now, so remember, our speech, our television show, our meme, these are all forms. And Kenneth Burke, a rhetorical theorist, writes that form is the creation and satisfaction of an appetite, right? And so I have these expectations. So when something has a masthead and it has columns and it has headlines, I read it as news. When someone sits at a desk and has a picture behind them and reads the news, I listen somewhat uncritically because I knew there were rules that they had to follow and what they could present. But now, since the revoking of the Fairness Doctrine and just the general proliferation of media, the explosion of information, all of these things, there really are no rules. And what happens is that people are primed to read certain cues as legitimate because they adopt the form. So we've all seen sources that are not reputable that present themselves as legitimate by adopting these visual cues. I can't tell you the number of times I have told people on Facebook, hey, that's actually an article from The Onion. Or, I mean, let's be real, the number of times that I have had to do a double take on an article that I'm about to repost because they used the cues of the form and it lulled me into a sense of security. So although they adopt the form, they might not necessarily be news, and they certainly might not be true. And so constant vigilance is really important right now. So the form of conspiracy rhetoric is made up of different strategies. And this is my second talking point, right? How should we think about conspiracies? How can we break them down? What is actually useful? And overall, conspiracy rhetoric is a form that is read through the lens of logical argument, through the rational world paradigm. So what that does is it feels logical and rational because it uses a lot of evidence. It follows the process of claim, data, warrant, or conclusion, but it invariably contains fallacies of reasoning, like how we get from data to claim, or faulty evidence. And this is important because normal rational argument does not work with actual conspiracy theory believers, right? Research actually shows that if you include refutative evidence in an article about conspiracy, For those who already believe the conspiracy, their beliefs will actually be reinforced. And as anyone who has dealt firsthand with someone who believes a conspiracy theory knows, providing counter evidence prompts those people to dig their heels in even more. So when I get to my final thoughts about how to deal with conspiracy believers, I'll explain more about how, although refutation does not work, encouraging critical thinking does. So we're not going to totally give up on rationality and logic quite yet. Another element of conspiracy is webbing. And basically, this is when various pieces of information, disinformation, and conspiracy elements are linked together in this vast explanatory conspiracy network. In conspiracy theories, everything is interpreted in light of the conspiracy. And an example of this is the notion that 5G spreads coronavirus led to the destruction of some 5G towers, right? And the way the logic went was that because 5G was expanding as the coronavirus was starting to surge, they must somehow be related. Now, this is associative logic, it's false cause, it's connecting things that aren't necessarily related, but that is an example of the conceptual slippage that happens in conspiracy rhetoric. And so when we're making arguments in the public sphere and putting things like this out there, it might feel correct because it draws on that logical form. And as we try to engage in dialogue using rhetoric like this, we might feel like something's not quite right, but we can't put our finger on it. And hopefully understanding some of these strategies will give us the language to be able to kind of call them out or see what's actually happening. The next rhetorical strategy is equivocation. And this is when similar things are replaced incorrectly. A good example of this happened during the birther conspiracy when Donald Trump and others were trying to claim that then President Barack Obama was not an American citizen and therefore not eligible to be president. And the way the argument went was Obama presented a live certificate of birth, but Trump and other people were claiming that they wanted the long form birth certificate. They wanted the long form birth certificate over and over. Now, actually, these things are the same thing, but the difference in labeling, right, equivocation, the difference in labeling was used in order to exploit and to support a conspiracy theory. Another thing about conspiracy theories that we can notice is that they're self-sealing. And what that means is they create their own verification. They're closed systems, which is very unhealthy for public sphere discourse. And within the self-sealing notions, this lack of proof of the conspiracy is actually interpreted and read as evidence of the conspiracy's efficacy or the power of the conspiracy. So there were conspiracies that presented the coronavirus or the emergence of it as absolutely fake and that it wasn't even real. And instead, it was just a plot to thwart Trump's reelection. And at the time, Trump himself would say that they, quote unquote, the scare quotes, meaning all the mainstream news sources were in on it. They were all exaggerating symptoms. They were inflating the numbers of death. They were obscuring causes. They were hiding the cures, all of this so that Trump would not be reelected. In this case, Trump and others presented a conspiracy that was so powerful, they could literally do everything. And so it's self-sealing because although there's no evidence, it's because the opposition is so powerful, they're able to hide or silence anyone who would speak against them. This also has the added benefit of making the person who does speak out against the conspiracy, in this case, Trump, a brave champion. So these exigents and constraints work together to make conspiracy theories more viable for people. And those specific rhetorical strategies are used to convince people. But what people, right? So audience is the third factor we consider during our rhetorical exploration of conspiracy. And audience is important because as we move forward to think about how to counter faulty thinking, we need to be cognizant of the actual audience. And as I mentioned before, most people are not diehard conspiracy theory believers, but they may believe misinformation or disinformation. And we may believe misinformation or disinformation, right? The they kind of gets me sometimes. So it's important to know the difference because different strategies work on different types of belief. So for example, ridicule is actually a rhetorical strategy that I'm not necessarily advocating for, but it's a rhetorical strategy that works well to counter misinformation. So for people who are not fully committed to some attribution of motive, some conspiracy theory, ridicule, and think about like Saturday Night Live, John Oliver, Trevor Noah. These types of forms can actually work to dissuade people of potentially false beliefs. So if I believe that vaccines may cause autism, but then I see John Oliver make fun of Jenny McCarthy and her anti-vax perspective, along with citing evidence and sources, that can be enough to move me away from that belief, or at least more likely to destabilize it enough to prompt me to question my belief. So if we know in terms of audience that most people are not full-blown conspiracy zealots or conspiracy advocates, but rather victims of misinformation or consumers of misinformation, what does that mean? What can we do? And so this brings us to the third question. What can I do, or what to do? So first, pre-bunking, right? Research shows that pre-bunking is incredibly effective. And this isn't surprising, right? Because being ahead of the curve allows people to write the narrative. When people have less information, they are more easily persuaded. So to provide information that people might feel fear around can be super helpful. Additionally, affirming the process itself can also be effective in that it simply reassures people. So one of the biggest sources of vaccine reluctance was uncertainty about the speed at which vaccines had been tested and approved, right? That was a common thing that people said. And what this indicated was that people were accustomed to, or they thought that FDA approval for it to be valid needed to take a long time. So the quick approval time made people nervous. In this case, to simply provide information about the approval process could have reassured people who might have been afraid. But again, this information needed to be deployed when we first started talking about vaccines, because this type of information is much more effective when offered earlier rather than as a reaction. And again, when offered as a reaction, it can potentially have that counter-affirming impact of committing people further to wrong information, right? They're suspect. Second, we need to recognize that people are oftentimes, rightly or wrongly, emotionally connected to their beliefs. Last fall, I was on NPR because wearing a mask became, for some people, a sign of disloyalty to then President Trump. And increasingly, we all know this, right? Things are politicized and polarized. And so often, unfortunately, people are listening to respond and not to hear. And it sounds hokey, but it's totally true. We need to just listen to each other, right? Currently, to be wrong is a really threatening thing in our society. And we sprinkle in this whole cancel culture that we have going on. And is it any wonder that we're defensive? Furthermore, conspiracy researchers, people like me, like to make these pronouncements about the types and quality of evidence and sources that should be required for something to be believed. And again, I don't know about y'all, but sometimes, especially if I'm afraid or destabilized about my current condition, that can prompt me to be a little bit defensive and be like, you're not the boss of me, and I'll believe what I want, which can quickly devolve into this relativism that tries to reposition truth claims, data, and evidence as a matter of belief. And so being emotionally detached, or being as emotionally detached as possible when talking about information, facts, and data is important, because there's a big difference between that and an opinion. So I encourage people, and I try to be empathetic, right? Research shows that building trust is much more important than trying to convince someone in one interaction. And it shows that people who move away from conspiracy beliefs, actual conspiracy beliefs, do so because of interactions with someone they trust. And we've also seen an uptick in trusting of local medical professionals. So this is an opportunity, right? People are not going to read an article in the Atlantic or the Wall Street Journal and suddenly have a change of mind and be converted. But if they have an empathetic conversation with someone they respect, they might relax their defenses a bit. So to be empathetic, certainly find a point of agreement, right? But then rather than tell, ask. And this can be hard. It is super hard for me. Please do not ask my children about how good I am at this because I will fail miserably. But I always want to go into lecture mode. I want to whip out evidence. I want to drop some data, right? And this is exactly the wrong tact to take. Instead, ask people why they believe what it is they believe, or where do they get their information. Acknowledge the sheer volume of information that we all need to sift through. Affirm this must be hard for you, and offer media literacy web pages or lists of reputable sources to seek information from in a comparable way, in as equals in a conversation. Studies show that when you're able to encourage critical thinking skills, even in conspiracy believers, those people who are entrenched, they actually often change their own minds through research. Okay. Third, we want to amplify sources and voices that are reputable. In the first few months of the pandemic, conspiracy and disinformation websites were being created and shared at incredible numbers. Meanwhile, the CDC and the World Health Organization's little web pages were over there languishing and had way fewer hits. And so to amplify reputable sources is key. Share them on social media after you've read them. I include a whole bunch of stuff at the end of this presentation that are pretty cool, and we'll talk about them. Fourth, in terms of what to do, is to encourage critical thinking skills, right? Critical thinking and media literacy can be promoted through the sharing of these things on social media. So when we first were told to stay at home during the pandemic, I had to tell my mother a whole bunch of things about in terms of media literacy, because she would Google things and she didn't realize that the first couple of things that would come up oftentimes were ads. And so she needed to learn how to look through a search. She also I told her about how Google uses cookies, which basically means that future searches are based on prior clicks. And we're increasingly living in these echo chambers and these silos of information that have exactly the virtually opposite effect of the Fairness Doctrine's idea about exposure to alternative ideas, right? If we want alternative, fair and balanced stuff, we need to seek it out. Relatedly, teaching people what to look for in reputable news sources, basics of media literacy, is important. Sites like PolitiFact, Washington Post Fact Checker, factcheck.org, and my favorite, Snopes.com. These are all sources and web pages that already do this, right? So simply retweeting or posting these sources can call attention to them, but can also create new wells of information that people might dip into for information. And these pages note that if you have an emotional reaction to the headline, if the article uses a lot of rhetorical questions, if all of a sudden all kinds of pop-up ads are coming up, those are all warning signs that this site may not be fair or balanced news. It could be clickbait. It could just be trying to get you to click on the next link. A special caveat or potential suggestion when dealing with people who don't trust mainstream news media now, which I hear increasingly, there are media literacy pages and even an app called All Sides that shows media bias by presenting stories from the left, the right, and the center. And so when you're able to see all three presentations of the same, are ostensibly the same information, it helps people to learn how to read through the bias, to see where it shows up, and to see those kind of fallacies that we talked about earlier. Also on the research page, I can probably click to it. Hold on. Oh, yeah. Also on this page, I've put a couple interactive games down at the bottom that demonstrate, again, the spread of misinformation and fake news. And understanding these things as you become aware of them and kind of hip to them, it's totally not the right word, but it helps you defend yourself. It helps you to see it, the next time it pops up. So these are obviously just a couple basic ideas that I think most people can use reminders of, and some people need to be introduced to. I do think that we are all a we in this. There is not a they. I'm very much about getting rid of that. But this is at least a beginning, because what most of us who research conspiracy can agree on is that disinformation does not gain traction among people with scientific and media literacy. The problem is that as humans, we tend to very much not be aware of our blind spots, and we often overestimate our knowledge. We think it can't happen to us, it's only them, when in fact it's already happened to us. So my motto is constant vigilance and do your detective work. And so I'm happy to take questions.
We do have a few that have come in, but by all means, if folks have more questions, please go ahead and enter those in the Q&A. So first we have one that's asking if you could please comment on the 911 Commission report, the 9/11 Commission report, as a conspiracy theory. This report has been debunked by architects and engineers for 911 Truth and others, but the public and legal system do not seem to take notice.
Mm-hmm. I actually can't speak to the 911 Commission report or the conspiracy. That's not one of the ones that I have researched, and I'm really hesitant to kind of make pronouncements about things like that. Because I teach about the general kind of conspiracy theory, obviously forms and strategies, and that's just not what I'm familiar with, or as familiar with as I'd like to be.
So someone else mentions, I was interested in the finding that conspiracy beliefs are relatively constant over time.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that some cultural contexts, like Soviet totalitarianism, some ideological meta-tendencies, like social theories like Marxism and its cousins, are conducive to non-falsifiable conspiracy theory, or thinking, sorry. Are these sorts of large-scale factors exceptions to the general rule that conspiracy thinking is relatively constant?
No, and what I should say, and I should probably actually change my notes, is that this is conspiracy thinking or conspiracy belief in the United States has remained fairly constant over time, right? I don't necessarily do kind of international conspiracy theory changes, which obviously those contexts absolutely would affect everything that is relevant in the rhetorical situation, both the kind of individual psychological predispositions, the kind of sociological, societal differences, and obviously the kind of institutional power and media creation of different explanations would all affect it. So I think that's exactly right.
In your view, how dangerous are conspiracy theories or conspiracy theorists to democracy?
That's a really hard question. It's a really hard question because I always want to be faithful to people and to people's ability to kind of think and reason and get information and do what is best. Obviously, the last several years have provided several instances where that's not always the case. And I think that what the increased polarization, particularly around conspiracy theories, the emergence of QAnon, for example, I think what all of those things point to are a significant issue in terms of our ability to talk to one another and our ability to share information and share in the process of knowledge creation, right? Particularly when we have things where knowledge is going to change and we're going to learn things. And with the internet, we learn things quickly, sometimes maybe too quickly. When those things are happening, I think it points even more to our need to have open, rational civic discourse. So I do think conspiracy theories are dangerous, but I also think that they can serve as kind of a cue for us to really take up the mantle of media literacy, take up the mantle of computer literacy, digital literacy, all of these types of literacies, because I believe that when people have a variety of information presented to them, and we can engage in that kind of discourse, I do believe that good solutions can come from that.
At 76, I worry that the current generation of 20-year-olds do not understand what you're teaching. Please tell me I'm wrong.
You're wrong. I think it's really interesting too. And there are studies that show that conspiracy belief is actually on the rise among young people, which is a little disconcerting. And I know from my children who are 17 and 20 that TikTok is evidently a thing, and there is a very deep well of conspiracy beliefs and rhetoric being offered on TikTok. But I also am, and probably all of those other places too. But I also know from working with my students that they have created TikTok videos, Instagram videos, whatever those things are called, posts that have been informational, that have been to debunk conspiracies or that have offered alternative information. And so I think the creativity, just as we may fear for the young people, I think the creativity and potential of the young people is also very great. And when I, as am a professor, am able to kind of release my fear and control around, you need to know this in this way, they are actually able to create kind of wells of knowledge that are different from things that I ever would have done that I think are much more effective with people their age. So again, I'm still hopeful.
So kind of adding on to that, what specific strategies do you recommend for helping children and youth develop media literacy so they're less vulnerable to conspiracy theories? And do some approaches seem to be more effective than others?
Yeah, I think, when I first started teaching public discourse a long, long time ago, one of the activities we used to do is I would go in and I would say to my students, go ahead and write a persuasive speech about something you want to persuade people about, some sort of informational thing that you want to persuade people. And so the students would give their speeches, and then I'd say, okay, now go give a speech for the opposite perspective, right? This kind of seeing of both sides, I think, is one part of that, which is why I really like that that website and that app that shows all the different ways a news story can be reported. And to have conversations, I think, to explicitly identify and say to people, well, what did you think about that article? What did you think about that? And seeing how misinformation can deliberately inflame our emotions or use fear as an appeal, right? To get it so that I'm actually basing my decision on the logical evidence and what might be best for most, not based in self and fear, is the goal. So I think that just basic media literacy. I also think limiting media is important. I know that I personally am on sabbatical right now, and I have taken a time out from a bunch of different news sources because I think you just need time to kind of let it all absorb and go back to human and then kind of re-engage. So I think limiting things, actually limiting, but at the same time exposing yourself to a wider variety, and also kind of recognizing that there are people on the other end of whatever this belief is. There are people. And so to kind of have some sort of empathy, or at least humanize that, is important.
So we have someone who is saying, I'm curious how charismatic authority specifically, does or does not play into the tenacity of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, so one of the things I wasn't able to talk about is this idea of a conspiracy advocate. There's this thing like conspiracy ethos, right? And so if a person, there are certain people where if they kind of retweet things, or if they're particularly charismatic, they can make things go more viral, right? So, and so I do think that particularly with media, that is a potential concern, because those people can oftentimes say things that get spread very uncritically. And also when we think about the way information spreads now, right, we have all of these personal media sites. So we have these sites like Facebook that were potentially originally created just so that, you could see pictures of the grandkids. And now they have been really politicized. And I saw a really interesting infographic the other day that talked about the fact that, most people are filtering and getting all of their news through Facebook, Twitter, not so much Instagram, but Facebook and Twitter is where people go to kind of click, and it creates those echo chambers. So I do think, got a little off point there, but I do think that like the charisma of people who might be a conspiracy advocate, I do think that that's really important. And I think that there was I'm not thinking of it right now, but there's an article that was written about conspiracy advocates and kind of the different elements of that ethos, right? The kind of demonstration of intelligence and of virtue and of goodwill. And I think one of the things that is most present in those conspiracy advocates is this idea that they're a champion. And historically, you know, conspiracies have always been those explanations offered by people not in power. So when Donald Trump, who arguably was the first conspiracy advocate in the White House, when he was in a position of power and still advocating for conspiracies, it was particularly interesting to people like me because he was presenting himself as being persecuted by mainstream media. And so he was kind of a victim and a champion, but also an advocate. And so he had that charismatic or that kind of authoritative, it's not a word, power.
So we have a couple questions that are coming in along the lines of how you think about conspiracy theories as political strategy and how that's emerging. You spoke to that a little bit, but as that becomes more common in candidate speak, could you speak to that a bit?
Sure. I also teach a class, and I'll be teaching it in the fall, presidential campaign rhetoric, where we study campaigning, right, and the history of campaigning and how it works. And campaigning has arguably moved very far away from the kind of idealized public discourse that we wanted to have in terms of free and open debate, right? Even the presidential debates are so constrained and they are so scripted that there's no opportunity for actual debate, for digging down. And I think that conspiracy increasingly is, and I mean, we've always had like dog whistles, right? We've always had kind of ways to allude to a deeper well of something. And so conspiracy theories, right? Like if you talk about the coming storm, that could be arguably heard as an allusion to QAnon. So while you don't necessarily have to say, I believe in QAnon, if you talk about, you know, I know a storm is a coming, then people who are QAnon sympathetic might hear that as a potential campaign strategy. And I think that increasingly fear is used as a strategy in political campaigns. And so my hope, and I believe what would happen is as people are more literate and less afraid, they are able to not necessarily react to fear appeals as much. But I mean, since the beginning of campaigns, we've had negative mudslinging kind of campaigning. And so it's not surprising to me that conspiracies are in on that now, increasingly. Did that answer the question?
Do you have any advice for someone trying to communicate with a loved one whose conspiracy theory beliefs are closely tied to their religious beliefs?
It's interesting because I also study conversion rhetoric. And I think that oftentimes when we think about religion or conspiracy theories or whatever it is, right? It's a belief. And so the degree to which that belief has been personalized and adopted, and the degree to which someone's identity is associated with that belief is really important when trying to change it, right? Because there's some people who have, I'm sure I am a person who have some beliefs that like, I'm not changing my mind, you know, I'm not, no. And so I think that counterintuitively, I'm going to say that I don't think we should try to change other people's minds, right? Like that's not going to work necessarily, but doing that whole, like being in communication with someone, being in conversation and saying, oh, why do you believe that? I mean, I know that I have been talking to a lot of people recently who, and I want to do some sort of research about this, who have been reluctant to get the vaccine. And invariably, one of the biggest things that people say to me when I talk to them about it and I ask them why, and I ask them what sources they're using and what information they have, invariably, one of the things that they say to me is, thank you so much for listening to me. You know, thank you so much for listening and not yelling at me or telling me I'm wrong or any of that. And so I think that as we move forward, in addition to front ending the kind of media literacy that needs to happen with younger people in schools at all levels, we also need to kind of be open to a slower process, right? Because I want to change everybody's mind today. I want you to see my point of view today. And that might be an unrealistic expectation.
What are your opinions about censoring of conspiracy theories, such as QAnon, and other controversial thoughts on sites such as Reddit?
Yeah. These are hard questions. And any answer I give is subject to absolute flip-flopping upon further thought. But this is an interesting one, right? Because I do believe that kind of censorship is this potentially slippery slope and who gets to decide. But at the same time, I do believe that there are some kind of fundamental places from which we can go. So I think that, for example, the taking down or the blocking of proven misinformation, of just straight up wrong information, is potentially good. I also think that the Facebook did this thing where, like, if you have an article or whatever, if you try to repost it without reading it, it will prompt you to say, do you want to read this first? I think even things like that are really good, and they kind of might help prevent censorship, because I think that's a hard one. I'm against censorship, but I'm also, I do believe that there is some information that might need to just be taken down.
We'll give you a quick break and ask about the alien cup on the shelf behind you. What potions might that contain?
What potions? It has a truth serum. No, I'm kidding. Yeah.
One person is asking if you're familiar with the Ad Fontes media bias chart, and if so, what do you think of it?
I think that's the one that has all the different news sources in it, and it puts them in different places. I think I don't know that particular one, right? I think any of those, and I put a bunch of infographics, right? Different kind of charts that do things like that. I think that anything that does that is kind of like an okay way to start. But I think that, like, we need to do our research in addition to that, right? And I think that particularly when people are skeptical of the media, it is good to look at some of the academic work that has been done about bias, right? Because as an academic with tenure, I don't have to be afraid to write about Fox News's bias or about CNN's bias. And so when I do that research and I can demonstrate it, hopefully that can help to inform people. And increasingly, with the internet, good thing about it is that there are many more kind of crossover public scholarship avenues or venues. So we have like The Conversation or Medium, or places that will post articles by academics based on peer-reviewed research that are informed with a level of expertise, but also accessible to everybody. And I think that's the point of being an academic, right? Is that I study all of this very jargony stuff. And then I do these studies that take time, but then I can present that information to hopefully help inform other people. I got really far away from whatever that question was, but I hope that answers it.
This is an interesting one. Do you have any advice on how to educate or help a community that doesn't read or write and believes a lot of hearsay?
Ooh. Well, I mean, oral tradition would be relevant, right? I've never ever thought of that. But of course they would believe hearsay. Yeah. More conversation. More is better for me all the time.
We've got lots of questions still coming in. You touched on this briefly earlier, but do you believe that the rhetorical situation of conspiracy theories parallels that of cults?
Belief is a tricky thing, right? Belief is a tricky thing. And I think that it depends how you define a cult, right? But sure, because if you define a cult as kind of this closed informational system that is detrimental to people, maybe it would have that. Whereas conspiracy theories are kind of more about the explanation of power. It really depends on how you define things and in terms of what is your point, right? Because I know that for me, when I first started researching conspiracies, I would just get into all of these kind of circular arguments about what it was and what it contained and what it meant, but it wasn't really useful. And so I think that for me, it is about the public sphere. And so if I think about conspiracies as a cult, right? So to think about, for example, QAnon as a cult, is that useful? Does that kind of using of that lens shed light on their behavior, on what they believe, on how information gets transmitted, about the closed nature of the system? I think that if thinking about it in terms of a cult like that is useful, then we should do it. But sure, I think that any type of system of belief is susceptible to conversion rhetoric, conspiracy rhetoric, all of that kind of stuff.
We're getting down to the last few minutes. We have a question here. Is there a particular type of person or certain personality traits that make a person more susceptible to believing conspiracy theories?
I think, like a lot of the research has shown, I think everybody believes in conspiracy theories. Like we all believe in conspiracy theories. In terms of the ones that are really kind of tussled over or struggled over in terms of truth and become these kind of emotional, polarizing kind of things. Sure, I think it's all of those things that I talked about in the beginning. When people feel left out, when people feel disempowered, when people are afraid, all of those things, just like they make people ripe for joining a cult or joining a religion or starting a new exercise program, right? When people feel that way, they're gonna look for some sort of explanation. And conspiracy theories oftentimes give this universal explanation, right? They explain everything. And so that is comforting. And additionally, because you're then in on the conspiracy, you know how it works, then you're special, right? You have this information and it is very affirming in that sense. So I think that we have to think about kind of the psychological benefits of believing conspiracy and recognize those and try to find other rhetorical ways to access that, right? So if people feel afraid, we have to find ways, and I talk about this all the time in the public discourse, in the public sphere. Sometimes I feel like as there's more and more information and as it's demanded that we kind of adhere to a particular principle, we don't necessarily get to say what we think or our experience. And so then what happens is people present their experience as evidence, and experience and individual examples are the weakest form of proof. But that doesn't mean that they're not important to the overall civic health of an organization or of a community, right? So people need to feel heard, but then we also need to be able to find a way to look at actual data and actual evidence as we move forward. So yeah.
We're close to time, so I'm going to give you one more interesting one to end on. Has there ever been a conspiracy theory that almost got you into believing it? And if so, what got you to avoid it or falling for it?
I always start to fall for them. When I teach conspiracy rhetoric at Bates, invariably, I start getting creeped out. I start, getting a little nervous. And I think that what helped me is, one, I need to pull back. If I immerse myself in rhetoric that is advancing a particular conspiracy, I am going to begin to get wet with that immersion, like I need to kind of step back from it and think about it. And I think that one of the ways that whenever I start to think, maybe that's true, one of the things that I always do is go for the other side. What are people on the other side saying? And you have to absolutely seek it out. And sometimes it's hard, like your browser will not allow you, but to find the exact opposite perspective is where I go.
So we're just about at time. I want to thank you for that blitz of questions that you answered. I think we got to close to 20. So thank you very much. I apologize to everybody whose questions didn't get answered. We still had a handful that came in. But I do want to thank you again for speaking with us today. It's a fascinating talk, and remind everyone that the talk is going to be available on Facebook right after this program and on YouTube tomorrow on the library's YouTube page. We did have one question come in that I answered in the Q&A, but I want to answer for everybody here also that could we have a copy of the slides, and we are going to actually email out a copy of it. Will be a PDF of the slides. Will be linked to an email that you'll all receive tomorrow if you registered on Zoom. If you're with us on Facebook, I'll go ahead and put that in the comments on Facebook also, but that will be available. It actually is available now. So as soon as you see that link, you can go ahead and access it and see any of Professor Kelley-Romano's slides. So thank you again, everybody, for attending, and thank you for the wonderful talk. It's a lot for all of us to be thinking about, I think.